1 hour south of Great Falls, Montana, the original route of Lewis and Clark winds along the Missouri River and through the Little Belt Mountains. It is wild, rugged country, the kind of place where the land itself keeps secrets. Splintered off the Missouri is a small tributary known to the locals as Prickly Pear Creek. On a summer day in 1975, a young couple, Leslie and Dennis Larson, walked along the creek bank. They said they were looking to pick mushrooms. An hour later, the mushrooms remained unpicked, and Leslie Larson had vanished from the face of the earth. What happened next set the first domino falling in a case that would span decades, cross the entire country, and leave 2 women dead. This is the story of a man who believed he could kill and simply walk away. And for a very long time, it looked like he was right. The following account is based on official police records, court testimony, interrogation footage, and interviews that have rarely been seen until now. Dan Laframboise was an off-duty Montana State patrolman that day. He was waiting on his vehicle to be serviced at a local gas station when a car came speeding down the road and screeched to a stop. A man jumped out and ran across the street toward him. He ran up to me, Laframboise recalled, and he hollered, "My wife just fell in the creek and she drowned." The man identified himself as Dennis Larson. He was frantic, breathless, begging the patrolman to follow him back to the creek. On the drive over, Larson told his story. His wife Leslie had slipped and fallen into the water. Spring rains had swollen Prickly Pear Creek, making it deep and wide with a dangerous current. Leslie had been dragged under. Dennis claimed he had jumped in after her, that he'd been pulled into a log jam himself, that the water had been up to his chest. Laframboise listened carefully, and right from the start, something didn't add up. He says, "I jumped in at that first log jam," and he says, "I just got washed into that," Laframboise recounted. "I crawled out, and I says, 'Pretty deep, huh?' And he says, 'Oh yeah, way up like this.'" The patrolman paused. "Well, he wasn't wet, and I thought, what's going on here? That doesn't sound right." Laframboise called for backup, then began searching the creek himself. He followed the current downstream, figuring that if Leslie's body had been carried by the water, it would have snagged on one of several log jams along the way. But he found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign that anyone had been in the water at all. Within the hour, sheriff's deputies arrived and took over. Laframboise briefed them on everything he'd observed, leaving them with one final, damning detail. "I said, because where he showed me she fell in the creek, there was one set of tracks going down there, and those were his. There was no woman's track in there at all. And I said, she had never been there unless he carried her." While a search team continued to hunt for Leslie along the creek, her father, Bill Reynolds, was notified of the tragedy. He then had to place the worst kind of phone call imaginable to his wife, Leslie's mother, Lois. "I could tell something was drastically wrong," Lois Reynolds remembered, "because he was in tears, and he wanted me to come right home. And I said, 'Well, what's going on?' He said, 'Leslie died. She drowned, and you've got to come home, because I have to have you here.'" By the time Lois returned to Great Falls the following day, county authorities had already closed the case. Their determination: accidental drowning. No further investigation warranted. That finding did not sit well with Dan Laframboise. "I didn't think it was right," he said, "but there wasn't anything I could do with it. It was out of my jurisdiction." But Laframboise was not the kind of man to let something go. Unofficially, and on his own time, he teamed up with Leslie's parents to search Prickly Pear Creek until they found the body. "I went back down that creek, I don't know how many times, twice within the next week and a half, 10 days. I'd walk it going down, come back, and go down again. I never could find sign of her." A month passed. The spring floodwaters receded. The creek ran calm and clear again, and still, the search continued. Lois Reynolds and her husband examined every inch of that waterway. "We examined every spot on that creek, from Wolf Creek down and past where it goes into the river," Lois said. "My husband and his friend took a boat and examined every shoreline, every small island in that area, clear down, including in the Missouri River. Days of searching turned up nothing." Then Laframboise switched tactics. He began to watch the area wildlife, hoping that Montana's black bears might lead him to Leslie's remains. "If there's a body or anything down in that river bottom or in that creek bottom," he reasoned, "the bears are going to find her." So the patrolman started watching the bears, but they never dug up anything. The longer the search dragged on, the more convinced Laframboise became of the truth he'd sensed from the very first moment. Leslie Larson never fell into Prickly Pear Creek. Dennis Larson's story was a cover for murder. "I thought all the time there was something that wasn't right," Laframboise said. "He wasn't telling the truth, or he wasn't telling the whole story. He was hiding something." For 4 years, Lois Reynolds went back to that creek every single weekend without fail. She brought metal detectors, cadaver dogs, and plain shovels. Even Dennis Larson himself joined a few of the searches, though Lois noticed he wasn't exactly helping. He was just strolling along, she observed. Over time, Lois came to share the patrolman's suspicions. She discovered tracts of mining land owned by the Larson family and wondered if perhaps her daughter's body had been hidden there. "I had known that Larson had 2 mines in the Little Belts," she said. "They took a lot of equipment up there and dug the whole thing out. That didn't prove to be of any value. And then somebody reminded us of a mine out of Wolf Creek, and they came with a big semi with radar and all kinds of equipment, and they dug out that mine as far as they could go. Despite hundreds of search days and dozens of digs, neither police nor family could turn up a single trace of Leslie Larson. The disappearance went cold. Meanwhile, Dennis Larson collected on his wife's life insurance policy, one with a double indemnity clause, meaning that since Leslie died of an apparent accident, Dennis received double the payout. With the money in hand, the bereaved husband packed up and moved clear across the country to the state of Maine, putting 2,500 miles between himself and Prickly Pear Creek. There, he would find himself another bride, another insurance policy, and yet another fatal accident, this time at the bottom of an 80-foot cliff. Kathy Frost was a 26-year-old single woman living in Maine. One day in August, she spotted a personal ad from a man describing himself as an outdoorsman, seeking a lasting relationship. The man's name was Dennis Larson. Kathy and Dennis began a courtship. Within 3 weeks, Dennis proposed. Kathy talked it over with her mother, Audrey Pomeroy. She was lonely, Audrey recalled. She wanted somebody to love and to be with, to do things with. So Kathy said yes. She wanted to get married on Valentine's Day, February 14th, but Dennis Larson did not want to wait. Less than a month after they first met, Dennis and Kathy were married. The very next day, Dennis Larson took out an insurance policy on Kathy's life. It included a double indemnity clause that would pay nearly $400,000 if Kathy died in an accident. 3 weeks later, the couple took a trip to the high cliffs of Acadia National Park. Acadia sits on Mount Desert Island off the coast of central Maine, a haven for campers, hikers, and day trippers. The park sees nearly 3 million visitors each year. By 6 in the evening, most of the crowds have left for the day. That is precisely when Dennis and Kathy Larson arrived and made their way to Otter Cliffs, a rugged stretch of coastline with a clear view of the open ocean and a sheer 80-foot drop to the water below. At 7 o'clock, a call came in to the National Park Service ranger station. Ranger Boyd McFarland was in the area and took it. "Received a call on the park radio," he recalled. "A report of a woman falling off the cliffs. A man named Dennis Larson had reported that his wife had fallen from Otter Cliffs." McFarland set off to meet Larson at the scene. "I met him up at the road," the ranger said, "and then we came down here, and he showed me where she had fallen and where she had landed." McFarland walked carefully to the edge and looked over the drop. Kathy Larson was sprawled on the rocks below. Dennis claimed they had been hiking together, looking for otters, when he heard a scream. He turned around, and Kathy was gone. National Park Search and Rescue arrived on the scene hoping to resuscitate her, but Kathy was dead. Initially, the park rangers had no reason to believe the death was anything other than a terrible accident, but then they made a phone call to Kathy's mother, and everything changed. "Deep down in my heart," Audrey Pomeroy said, "something was wrong. Something happened that wasn't natural." She paused, then delivered the detail that would crack the case wide open. "Because she hated heights, and I know she wouldn't have been up there on that mountain. She wouldn't have done it if she wasn't made to do it." Audrey shared 3 crucial suspicions with the park rangers. First, there was her daughter's lifelong fear of heights and cliffs. Second, there was the insurance policy taken out on Kathy's life the day after the wedding. And third, Audrey had heard rumors about Dennis's first wife, a woman who had also died under mysterious circumstances, whose body had never been found. The Maine State Police were called in to investigate. Detective Jeff Harmon took the case. He called Audrey Pomeroy to learn everything she knew about her daughter's relationship with Dennis Larson. She had been an individual, Harmon recounted, had had a lot of relationships with men in the past. All of a sudden, she'd met Dennis Larson and was going to get married. There had been some discussion about life insurance. She just had a bad feeling about this and felt that something had gone wrong down at the park. She was absolutely convinced this wasn't an accident. Harmon believed the mother's suspicions were worth checking out. He placed a call to a detective out in Montana-Cascade County's Ken Anderson and asked him to run a check on Dennis Larson and any reports about his first wife's supposed accident. The result confirmed Harmon's worst fears. "I started doing research on Dennis," Anderson said, and pulled up his name and found that he had lost his wife in an accidental drowning back in 1975. Working together, the detectives obtained the original case reports from Montana. He had purchased insurance, Anderson noted. All of this kind of fit together in a pattern of someone who had been involved in a death case, an accidental death case before, had collected insurance money on it, was motivated to try to obtain a large sum of money so he could maintain his lifestyle. To the eye of these seasoned investigators, the pattern was unmistakable. Dennis Larson had killed his first wife in Montana, Montana. He figured he'd gotten away with it. Then he killed again in Maine. Each time, he collected on a double indemnity insurance policy. The detectives decided it was time to turn the screws. During his investigation, Jeff Harmon had leaned hard enough on his suspect that Dennis Larson decided to leave Maine and head back west. Dennis had told me that he was going to go back to Montana, Harmon recalled. Psychologically, I think he was becoming very stressed over this. You could see a gradual degradation in his personality. I think he wanted to get some distance between the investigation and himself. 2 months after Larson returned to Montana, Harmon followed him there and asked his suspect to sit down for an interview. It would take place in room 411 of the Sheraton in Great Falls. Jeff Harmon sat across from Dennis Larson, murder suspect. What Larson didn't know was that Harmon was wearing a body wire. In the next room, Montana detective Ken Anderson was recording every word of their conversation. "The only thing I'm interested in," Harmon began, "is what the facts are. What happened? You know the truth about exactly what happened." Harmon laid out his suspicions about the case and then presented a key piece of evidence, a medical examiner's report. It identified bruises on Kathy Larson's arms that were not consistent with her other injuries from the fall. These were bruises consistent with someone grabbing her forcefully, dragging her to the edge of a cliff, and throwing her over. "Yeah, there's marks there," Harmon told Larson. "Kathy didn't put those marks on herself, and there's nobody else. There's nobody else there but you and her." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "I know that those marks are there because I can see them. So all I can do is theorize as to what happened, because the marks are there, Dennis." The detective pressed further. "Why could she go like that? They're not caused by her. They are not caused by her." Dennis Larson bobbed and weaved, but he could produce no satisfactory explanation for the bruises on his dead wife's arms. Harmon kept pushing. And finally, something in Larson broke, sort of. What followed was, in Harmon's words, a dramatic shift. It started out being purely an accident, the detective recalled, to there being an argument with a physical confrontation. This is what Dennis Larson told them. "I guess we went down by the cliff, and she says, 'I don't love you anyway,' and gave me a push. And it just being off enough to where I gave her a push. And we weren't all that close to the cliff, but I pushed her hard enough to where she stumbled backwards and went off and scraped her belly." Larson had crafted his story carefully, just enough to explain the bruises on Kathy's arms, but stopping well short of admitting premeditated murder. Still, Jeff Harmon believed that Larson's statements, captured on that body wire, would be the crux of his circumstantial case. The suspect was arrested on charges of insurance fraud and held in the county jail, while Harmon worked on extraditing him to Maine. Before he left Montana, Dennis Larson agreed to an interview with a local news reporter. On camera, he made his case for innocence. "I wanted to see a wild otter that I had never seen before," he said. "So we went to Otter Cliffs. The details of the death, I feel, should be brought out in court and shouldn't be brought out at this time. But there was no murder involved." The following year, Larson told the same story to a Maine judge. After 8 days of testimony, the jury didn't believe him. Dennis Larson was found guilty of first-degree murder. The victim's mother, Audrey Pomeroy, was present for his sentencing. "I wanted him to get life," Audrey said. "I was kind of disappointed. The judge gave him 50 years, but better than 20. Larson was locked up at Maine's Thomaston State Prison, and the case of Kathy Frost was brought to a close. But 2,500 miles west, in Montana, there was another family still waiting for an answer. 15 years had passed since Lois Reynolds' daughter, Leslie, had apparently drowned after slipping into Prickly Pear Creek. With Leslie that day had been her husband, Dennis Larson, the same man now serving time in a Maine prison for murdering a second wife and collecting her life insurance. By a grim coincidence, Leslie had also had an insurance policy, one that Dennis had dutifully collected after the alleged drowning, even though Leslie's body was never found. After Larson's conviction in Maine, Lois Reynolds had no doubt her daughter had been murdered and that the killer was her own husband. "I was leaning that way anyway," Lois said, "but that proved it to me that he was capable of that." The conviction provided fresh hope. Lois put a call in to the Montana Department of Justice. Investigator Joe Uribe took the case. Lois was very well versed on the entire case, Uribe recalled. She had followed it from the beginning to the time when I met her, and in fact, did most of the investigative work herself. She believed that Leslie was murdered by her husband, Dennis. After reviewing both the Montana drowning file and the Maine homicide case, Uribe shared that belief completely. He attempted to build a case and continued the search for Leslie's remains. 10 years later, there was still no body, and Uribe doubted he would ever make a case for murder unless he could get Dennis Larson talking. In the fall of 2000, Joe Uribe flew to Thomaston State Prison in Maine and sat down with Larson. He decided to play on the convict's conscience, and he used Lois Reynolds as his trump card. "I told him that Leslie's mother, Lois Reynolds, had spent all of these years looking for her daughter," Uribe said. "That she wasn't getting any younger and she didn't want to die without knowing where her daughter was just to put her to rest." Larson's response was cold and dismissive. "He told me at that time that she's in the crick," Uribe recalled, "right where I said she was, and someday she'll surface, the gambit had failed. Uribe left the room no wiser than when he entered. But 3 hours later, something unexpected happened. Dennis Larson sent word that he wanted to talk again. Before making a statement, Larson tried to broker a deal, one that might someday get him out of prison. He set at a cap of 30 years, to be run consecutively. "I ask that my punishment for my crime in Montana," Larson proposed, "and be over 80 years old when I get out. That would mean I would return to Montana, spend another 10 years of my life in prison, but at least I would have that light." Detectives provided Larson with no assurances, but the convicted murderer continued anyway, giving specific details of Leslie Larson's last moments on Earth. "Found a spot along the creek, that there was a large tree that had fallen down into the creek," Larson said, "and the water was riding up pretty bad. And I pushed her in at that point, and she got tangled up in the limbs and couldn't come up for air because the stream was rushing by too quick. And she drowned right there." After 25 years of silence, the truth had finally spilled out. Investigator Uribe called it what it was: justice. It's finally justice for Lois. This man had never been addressed. This issue had never been addressed. And finally, he had come forth and taken responsibility for Leslie's death. Justice, however, sometimes has its own way of balancing the scales. Just 3 months after confessing to Leslie's murder, Dennis Larson's body was found at the bottom of the Thomaston prison rock quarry. A clothespin was clamped on his nose. His mouth was wrapped shut with tape, and scrolled across that tape, in Larson's own hand, was a single word: Geronimo. The official cause of death was listed as suicide. Dennis Larson, the man who had killed 2 wives and spent decades evading full accountability, had taken himself out of this world on his own terms, or at least tried to make it look that way. He left behind no final explanation, no map to Leslie's remains, no last act of decency. The word on the tape, Geronimo, was the cry of a man leaping into the void. Whether it was defiance or despair, only Larson knew, and he took that answer with him. To this day, Leslie Larson's body has never been found. Her empty grave stands as a question mark, the final unresolved mystery in a case full of them. For Lois Reynolds, the search never truly ended. "We spent every waking moment up here on weekends," she said, her voice quiet with decades of grief, "trying to find that spot, because we were sure she was there somewhere. And now, of course, I have no idea. I don't think she went to the river. I never will. Everybody else seems to think that way, but I don't."